Good afternoon and welcome to the January 23rd Budget Commission meeting. I am Katie Howard, your chair. Ms. Harrison, will you call the roll, please?
Yes, Madam Chair. Representing Educational District 1, Ms. Katie Howard.
Present.
Representing Educational District 2, Ms. Alretta Bowden.
Present.
Representing Educational District at Large, Seat 9, Ms. Jessica Johnson.
Present.
Also present, we have our Superintendent, Dr. Brian Johnson, as well as Madam General Counsel, Nina Gupta. Madam Chair, we have a quorum.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. With that, do I have a motion to approve the December 19th Budget Commission minutes?
So moved.
Do I have a great second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. And now we need to approve our agenda for today. Do we have a motion to approve today's agenda?
So moved.
Great. And seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Wonderful. Let's get right into our presentations and definitely discussion. We have a very healthy agenda. Thank you, CFO Bracken, of course, for being here with your team. And I'll hand it over to you and the superintendent.
Alrighty, so we'll dive right in. We have 4 agenda items we're going to cover today. We'll start with just a broad overview of the governor's state of the state. This does help guide our projections for our state revenue. Then we'll talk about some of our assumptions around the FY26 preliminary revenue projections for the other funding sources. And we're going to spend a good amount of time today talking about the TADs, the tax allocation districts that the district supports. And also we'll give an overview of the school allotment process. So to begin with, all of the figures you're going to see on the next few slides are at the state level. So these are not what APS expects to receive from these locations. It's at the high level. We'll still need to work through what that actually means for us as a district. This is what was part of the initial FY25 approved budget. Just for a reminder, there was a significant investment in education in QBE, especially around enrollment, huge increases in state health benefits that the state did support for our certified staff. We are still 100% funding classified staff, and then also increases to the state salary schedule for FY25. For the amended, so this would be an adjustment to the current year budget, if approved, includes additional increases to QBE for enrollment growth across the state. There is a change to the charter system grant. There is an impact that will be directly at, is that me? It will be directly at APS for a couple of our charter schools. And then increase there has been a proposed increase for the $47,000 that was in the initial budget as a state grant for safety and security, to increase that by an additional $21,000 for one-time funds. You'll recall after the initial budget, we did go back and add SROs at our elementary schools, and we've been attempting to find lap salary and savings within the additional within the existing budget to cover that cost. So this additional one-time funding would help us in the current year to fund that investment in SROs, and then going forward, we can fold those into our recurring budget. For FY26 high level, assumptions include still more increases to state health, both for certified and classified employees. So this is a big cost for all school districts. Enrollment continues to go up at the state level. So another $305 million into the QBE to support enrollment growth. More money in the transportation grant, the custodian supplement, connectivity, and then also vocational classrooms. So investments in all of those. Again, TBD, how much will come to Atlanta for that. $178 million for construction and renovation, money for school buses, about 227 across the state. Continuing to invest in expansions for dual enrollment. The Promise Scholarship, which also could be referred to as the voucher bill, $141 million to establish that for eligible K-12 students. There is a proposal to increase the funding for the statewide funding for the school psychologist ratio. and additional investments for GNETs and additional vocational and agricultural educational equipment, and those would be state grants if those are approved. Any questions on the governor's proposals? And again, this will need to go through a full process before we know how this actually gets shaken out. It is typically late February, March before we know what mid-year adjustments we could expect. And we would bring those to you as a budget adjustment later on in the year if we're able to adjust our current budget to claim those resources.
Great, thank you. Aretta, I'll start with you.
Sure. Oh, for the security grants, what was the original allocation from the previous year?
Yeah, it was of the previous year or the current year?
Oh, the current year, yeah.
The current year that we're in, it was a little over $47,000 per school with a school location code. So we have schools with multiple campuses, and so we're not receiving it per campus, we receive it per school location code. We passed on 45,000 of that into each school's budgets for them to use as they need within a menu of options that we provided to the schools, and held back a portion of that to support an expansion of our AED devices.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brackman. Sorry I was a minute late, but I did review the documents in advance. Anything surprise you here? Is there anything here that is beyond that you draw our attention to that was greater than we might, or conversely less than we might have expected?
No, we're the primary things we're keeping our eye on at this early stage of the development process is if there are any specific targeted numbers around salary increases for teachers, or if we see any big new investments like the safety and security grant that was teed up this time last year. And so this, we're not seeing anything new like that being proposed, just more incremental adjustments to existing programs.
So,
So nothing really surprising.
I know there has been those yearly, over the last few years, the governor has added dollars to the salary schedule. Are we at the point in the schedule where we don't think that's coming this year?
I don't know that there was anything particular around. There wasn't anything particular around compensation. That doesn't mean it won't happen. Typically, if it's a big number, though, we do like to lead with that. And so maybe some incremental like COLAs or cost of living adjustments will be built into the QBE allocations throughout the process. But I'm not anticipating large increases.
And just a reminder to everyone, this is TBD.
All right.
And you're saying at the end of February, we'll hopefully have a better idea. I mean, obviously, the General Assembly has to adopt the budget by, I don't know the exact date.
Yeah, it's in April, typically. So it will start to firm up as we get closer to the end, but we won't actually make any adjustments to our budgets until it's approved and we get the revised QBE sheets or the recommended QBE sheets for next year.
Because wondering, I guess, Aretta, maybe this is yours or maybe not, is, how this impacts as we obviously plan the budget. Would it help offset or be more additional, like looking at additional money for SROs, which would be right now 21,000. So just how we continue to talk about that, particularly here.
Yeah, I think the one-time cost that is being proposed for the current year would offset because we would be using fund balance to fund those SROs in the current year because it was an addition after the budget was approved. And so that would offset it. We would still need to think about for FY 2026, because again, this is just for the current year as a one-time, would not help us close any gaps for FY 26, how we fold those recurring salaries into the long-term budget.
And thank you for pointing that out as well. One-time amounts. Thank you.
Alrighty. So that leads us to our revenue projections overall. We are currently building the FY 2026 budget, assuming that we will maintain a millage rate of 20.5 mils. So as we are looking at our local revenue projections and our projected growth on the digest, we're applying a 20.5 millage rate to that to assume what our rates would be. This is a history of the millage rate. You can see the orange line where we've decreased by a mil in 2018. and adjusted by 0.24 mils in 2022. And then the digest has continued to grow each year. For local revenue, the current year, we're currently tracking ahead of pace for collections. Overall, we expect to collect about $952 million as opposed to the $944 million we forecasted. That's due in part to a couple of competing issues. One is we collected more in our TAD pilots for FY 2025 than we had projected, but that is somewhat offset by property tax collections overall, which are lower than projected because of a high number of appeals. We do talk about our commercial properties and the need to get more value from our commercial properties. So this number was really eye-opening to me. Currently, 41% of the total assessed digest for our commercial properties is under appeal. And that compares to only 12% of our residential properties. So we continue to see our businesses taking advantage of the systems in ways that maybe it shifts burden to other areas of the digest. The overall revenue projection for FY26, these are more conservative in nature than we went this current year. So we are projecting about a 5% growth overall in the digest, and again, offset by some other factors. But this does assume that we are able to opt out of House Bill 581. If we do not opt out of House Bill 581, we can take $20 million off of that. So we would expect about $962 million in new revenue. Any questions on local revenue?
Loretta, then Ken.
So I have a general question that's going to come around millage. It's still percolating, but there's some curiosity in this space in terms of what type of flexibility that we have here. Then the appeals, in general, how successful are those? Is there like a trend that we can look at and say, yeah, we've got 41% that are in appeals, but in general, only 25% of those actually go through? Like, what is the expectation in that area around appeals, specifically in the commercial area?
Yeah, we would have to pull that information, work with our tax assessor's office to identify how successful or what percentage of appeals are successful. What we do know is prior to, so House Bill 581, which would cap that's the piece of it we've talked about the most, is that it would cap our local revenue increases. Also provides a section that helps to address some of the appeal process, though. So one of the current benefits of appealing is that just by the nature of appealing, it freezes your values. And so sometimes it doesn't matter if it's successful or not. It takes so long to work through the appeals process that your values are frozen at that lower level that it definitely impacts our ability to collect on that. And so this would add some language that says, you have to go through the appeals process, and if you're not successful, your values are not frozen. So that goes back and reclaims at the higher level. So it does have some language that helps to solve for some of that. But right now, just appealing freezes your base value. And so that's why you would see somebody that has the means to appeal, whether they think the values are correct or not, might go through that process, might see it a worthwhile endeavor in that.
How long does that freeze?
3 years.
3 years? Okay. There'll be more. I'll pause now.
Okay.
Can I ask one quick clarifying question? So for the opt-out, that's what would happen with House Bill 581. It would change the period of freezing?
So us opting out doesn't opt out of those pieces. Those are separate pieces within the legislation. So those are occurring and impact the tax assessor's office more so than any local municipality. So us opting out, we're only opting out of the piece of the bill that would cap our digest, the values of our digest.
So there would be changes in terms of the assessment.
That would still
Piece.
happen. That
That
piece
would
is
still
still
happen,
running.
no matter what, opting in or opting out.
Mhm.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for this analysis. To me, this is a story we're not talking as a city enough about. Is this under appraisal and under taxation of our commercial space? Because this 41%. So I'd love to see it. I'd love to see it historically. Like, how does that number? What is that 40? What does 41 compare over the past few years? Is that number on the rise? Because the other thing that that's not clear from this, but we know to be true, is that's 41% of a number that's already underappraised. So these appraisals, by some estimates, 50% are of appraised values. When we see properties that are sold for a certain value and appraised for half that, which to me, when it sells, that's what the market says, but it's still being appraised at less value. And then you still have, then of that, you're still, this is even thinning the pool more. And so the consequence is that we have to go to our homeowners and say, you have to carry the water here. And so I guess my question is I'm gonna turn this into a question you're gonna see. It's gonna be, we gotta pay attention though, it's gonna be quick. How do we tie this to our legislative priorities? So we do have a legislative priority around asking commercial property to pay their fair share. I know, I don't see Erica Long here, or maybe Dr. Johnson, maybe this is a note for you to take back, but is there, because the challenge has always been, how do you make this happen? And maybe it's that we increase the staffing of these appeals process offices so we don't get swamped by the commercial entities that can spend way more on lawyers and way more into the process than the government can. And so, I don't know what the answer is, but I feel like we need tactical solutions to this, because this 41%, and I suspect if you when you show it to us over time, you're going to see that number's on the increase. So it's a lower number, and even that people aren't paying because they're winning. And so, and actually, it'd be great to see the success. To Aretta's point, what's the success rate? I think there's a story in there of commercial real estate avoiding their tax responsibility, and then it's being shifted. So we have two choices: we either do less or we give it to our homeowners. And to me, neither of those are ideal. So I'd love to see that work into our legislative agenda.
Well, and one thing to add to that, it affects all school systems because, it is my understanding there's a loophole in the law at the state level. And there has been legislation proposed in the past to address it, and it hasn't moved forward. So I'm with Dr. Zeff and my colleagues on how we have this conversation, which I know Erica Long and team have certainly been working on at a broader level with other legislators, because even though we're seeing this particular hit of 41%, it may look a little different for another school system, county. It's still a huge impact. And it's been at the top, I know, the city's legislative agenda too, because they're losing revenue as well. And some of these commercial property owners have received tax abatements too,
I was going to
which
go
have
there
absolutely
next.
affected us long-term. And that we're gonna talk about too, and of course the TADs and everything else. So at the end of the day, it's not just APS, it's a lot of metro school systems, and maybe even beyond that. So we're here to do whatever we can to lean in, and hopefully the General Assembly can take some action, because all school systems need to make sure they're getting the money their students need, and that all property owners are paying their fair share.
So the bulk of our funding does come from local revenue, and just to your point, I think we need to continue to think about how we expand and get access to as many of those existing resources as possible. State, I did already talk about our preliminary assumptions for the state allocation are based primarily on the governor's State of the State address. So we do anticipate some increases based on his presentation, but again, that would be offset by the local fair share. Local fair share is where we get hit twice by our dependence upon local revenue. Every school district in Georgia has a set aside from their QB allotments that is the equivalent of 5 mills of their budget, right? So based on our millage rate, based on our local digest, per meal, the state says that we collect about 40 million. So back of the napkin, you could do 40 million by our 20.5 mills, and that's what the state says that we collect for local revenue. However, that's offset by the TADs, because we don't actually collect that revenue. It's offset by any exemptions, local exemptions. And so that piece is also increasing at a rate that is so high, it tends to offset what we get from the state. So even though our allocations for the state increase, our local 5 mil share is increasing at such a rate that it almost offsets that completely. So for that reason, our state projections are relatively flat going into next year. And that's the other reason why kind of depends a little bit less for us what the state does with their budget, because it's going to be offset for the most part by our local revenue, or our local 5 mil share. Other revenue includes things like tuition, investment interest, rental of our facilities, charter buyback, our field trips, and we're assuming that will stay relatively flat going into next year. Any other questions around our overall revenue and before I talk about our tax?
You're fine. So on the other funding, it looks like prior to the pandemic, we were kind of trending a little bit higher. Is there any context of what we see there? And then I see this includes kind of sale of assets, and maybe just a point of clarification for the properties that we have in the pipeline now. Does that include that, or is that in the next, I guess, for timing purposes, is that in this upcoming fiscal year or future fiscal year?
So we wouldn't have budgeted for any assumptions around that at this point in time. The historical question, some of those were related to one-time actual. So we had a large increase in E-rate for 1 year. We had a bubble where we submitted a lot all at once and had like a $3.5 million payment come in. So that typically stays right around that 6 to 7 million, with some years one-time assumptions kind of taking it out of.
Thank you.
All right. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of the TADs. I know that for some board members, this will be TAD 101 if we haven't had many conversations about the TADs in the past. For others, it might be a review, but since 1992, Atlanta has created 10 tax allocation districts, or TADs, to boost the economic development in Atlanta. We participate in 9 of the 10. So by 2015, we ranked second in the country for use of this mechanism for funding and for development in a city. The local revenues are offset by the TAD payments, and we have participated in, I'll show this chart first. So you can kind of see here, I know it's very small, but with the colors, you can see mostly where these TADs are located across the district. So we do have TADs that are positioned primarily in the center of the city. Those are the ones that we have supported primarily in the, historically. And in the last couple of years, we've started contributing also to the corridor TADs, which are down along the south side of the city. These are the 5 TADs that we have contributed to historically. The West Side TAD, which started in 1999, it is due to sunset in 2038. For all of these, that date is dependent upon when the bonds are actually paid off, so when the development costs are paid off. So it could flex a little bit, but is scheduled to end in 2038. There are, I won't go into the detail on the bonds, there are some incentives that come out of these, or pilot payments. In 2019, the APS negotiated with the city an omnibus TAD agreement, an intergovernmental agreement that allowed us to continue to participate in the expansion of the West Side TAD into the Gulch area. And for that, we negotiated some pilot payments back from our East Side TAD and from the West Side TAD outside of the Gulch area. So some of the immediate incentives around that was a $7 million payment 13.75 in 2019, and then going forward, it's 50% of whatever is collected in the West Side area outside of the Gulch area is piloted back to us on an annual basis. For Atlantic Station, that TAD was due to close out, I believe, in 2024 or as soon as 2024. As part of the TAD IGA, we negotiated that APS would continue its contribution through 2027. And after 2027, whether the TAD remains open or not, we will begin to get an incremental payment or pilot payment back of our portion from the Atlantic Station TAD. For Perry Bolton, that TAD started up in 2003. It's due to sunset in 2041. Again, there is some that we negotiated that same term limit to that TAD. So even if it doesn't sunset in 2041, we would expect to get our incremental allocations back out from that TAD. The East Side TAD, those bonds were defeased in 2019. So even though the TAD runs through 2030, we are already getting 100% of our increment back through pilot payments as negotiated in the 2019 IGA. The Beltline TAD, when it was developed, we negotiated pilot payments back from that TAD. It ranges every year, but it will add up to $73.5 million from 2017 to 2031. So while the TADs are performing and doing a lot to boost the development, we're also getting some of the pilot benefits back real time because of that 2019 IGA. So a lot of great work done by the district that year to secure some relief from the TADs going forward. Also, as a part of that IGA, we began to add our increment to the corridor TADs. So investing the APS increment in the Hollowell MLK TAD, the Campbellton TAD, Metropolitan TAD, and the Stadium area TAD. However, we negotiated a cap, so our annual contribution is no more than $2 million in the years 2020 through 2023. We capped our investment to $5 million in 2024 to 2028, and 6.5 through the remainder of the life of the TAD. So we do have piloted back to us any of our increment that exceeds that cap amount for each of those TADs. So this is more information about the TADs, just the base value of the TADs when they were created, the current value of the TAD, the change in value. So you can see since the TADs were created, overall property values within those TADs have increased by 555%, or over and $765 million of APS increment is what we have foregone for those TADs. So the current increment is about 85% of our allocation that is going into the TADs. Taking the takeaways, so the overall overview of the TADs, the current year's impact, so this is FY 2025 digest, $96.9 million of our total digest is allocated within the TADs, which means that our tax levy, we bill those properties at our 20.5 millage rate, but the revenue from those properties does not come to us. It's reinvested back in the TADs. That is the equivalent of 2.4 mils. So said differently, if the TAD money was coming to our district, our millage rate would be 18. So that's how much our total millage rate would be impacted by this. We have already, as I already mentioned, invested about $765 million of the APS tax increment into the TADs, and before everything is completely paid out and closed out, we will invest another $1.6 billion for a total investment in the TADs of $2.36 billion. So here's some of the things that you were talking about, or like some of the promise of the TADs that we haven't necessarily experienced. So one of the things that we expect is for that development to occur. However, and the IGA does get some of that increment back to us real time. However, some of the benefits of the TADs, like the halo effect, so when development doesn't necessarily know geographic boundaries, so when you start seeing development in one area, the assumption is that it will also improve or make areas around the TADs more attractive, so you'll see more growth there. But we do see underassessed values. of those properties, offsetting some of those increases, high numbers of appeals, or different abatements or different funding mechanisms overlaying with the TAD that helps to offset some of that benefit that we could be receiving from the TADs. The other pieces of this, and we started talking about it last time, is development comes with challenges for our families. And so as we see these values increasing, which is good, in many cases it would displace some of our families without protections to also come in and support that. And so there it is, the TADs come with some risk associated with them as well. I've kind of talked through the IGA pieces as we went through it, but this is everything we agreed to in the IGA on one slide. And then the next few slides just drill into each one of the TADs in more detail. So this is the West Side TAD. You can see the increment that we've invested there over time, how much we are getting piloted back from that. Atlantic Station TAD, again, how much we've invested there, and what we should expect for the closeout for that TAD. Harry Bolton, East Side, Beltline, and our new investment in the corridor TADs. So with that, I'll take any questions that you have.
Yeah, let me cut to the punchline here. Are there any new TADs coming, and are any of these TADs going to be renewed?
So nothing's made it to my radar. I'll say that. I do know that different people have said, hey, we've been approached, or we've had questions, and so nothing's come to my radar about any of that. I will say that in the past, when we were approached with extending the West Side TAD into the Gulch, we leveraged that opportunity to get a lot of wonderful, great things back to APS. So whatever conversations we're having around the TADs, I would hope that we will be just as aggressive in making sure that APS has what we need for our students and our constituents and our families as we renegotiate whatever conversations are going to be had around the TADs going
So
forward.
there's no renewals that are.
I'm not aware of any renewals.
And then, is there any way of knowing whether or not the APS? I mean, we call these TADs successful. I mean, the developments are successful. We're not sure about the TAD's role in their success. Is there any way of knowing if, but for APS deciding to take dollars from the classroom and give it to developers, that this projects wouldn't have happened?
Yeah, I don't think that there is a, I forgot which slide we put it on. Board policy DFA is the board policy that outlines our work and commitment to the TADs, and it does explicitly call out that but-for provision. And so at this point, regardless of whether or not the TADs would have historically performed in the way they did without our contribution, I think that we can ask that question about any renewal of TADs or any extensions of TADs. If they are successful or we're seeing development happen in those areas, would that still occur even if we didn't continue to invest our increment in that? And I think that's a real question for the board to wrestle with.
Yeah, and I appreciate the way you framed it, that, so then you get the promise of development, but then again, that development seems to find its way outside of the taxable authority. Mm-hmm. And so I think tying those together, it just seems like we're not best positioned to extract the value that we've given. And so, I appreciate that. That's why the first two questions to me are the most important. If none of them are being renewed and there's nothing else coming, then this is good to get this update, but there's no action that the board needs to take right now.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Zeff, for your way with words. I appreciate you. And I guess what I'm struggling with is looking at changes in values and areas and thinking about, you touched on it a little bit, how our families are being displaced. And what I'm looking for is where can there be relief to, I guess, the individuals and families that own properties, and also the folks who are dependent on owners to rent. So when I look at this, all I'm seeing is I see a lot of benefit going to businesses and a lot of consequences coming to our children, and that's frustrating. And I'm just trying to figure out what can we do to refocus or to apply pressure so that we are not taking dollars from our classroom and putting them in some places where they may or may not need that development, right? So that's kind of what I'm struggling with right now. And I am too glad that there are no new ones. And I will pause there. But yes, thank you.
Yeah, I went back to this slide just to be able to demonstrate some of the value increases. So when we talk about how property values have increased across Atlanta in the last decade, for example, Atlantic Station since 2000 has increased 11,000%. And Perry Bolton, 836%, Beltline, 681%. None of that's coming to APS. So the value increase that's occurring within the TADs, our constituents feel, we don't necessarily feel that in our local revenue, which does mean that we're still highly dependent on the areas outside of the TADs to fund this district.
And is it true then that the homeowners that live in that area, they are experiencing those tax increases because they are seeing their values go up, the mills are the same, so they are bearing that pain?
And they would see Atlanta Public Schools on their tax notice.
Right. Right.
And
And
with
so
that big number beside it, and that money isn't necessarily coming back to us. It's going to pay off the bonds
We need
of
an
that
asterisk.
area. We need an asterisk by it.
Well, going back to the 2019 agreement. So things were negotiated, thankfully. I have questions pertaining to that. So we are receiving all our pilot payments on time and in full. Is that correct?
Yes.
What are the chances of maybe additional agreements or an extension of that or conversation like we're saying with the city, knowing where we are with TADS at this point, knowing where the impact to our school communities, recognizing that the city is very focused on this work too in terms of creating more affordable housing. Because I did see in some of the agreements that it was very specific for that area, but around the creation of a school. And that was a particular situation. But what is the openness? Has there been recent conversations with the city at this point? Because we also know that, TAD doesn't close until the development costs are paid. So the fact that at least Atlantic Station, we're out in 2027 no matter what, we're out of the East Side TAD, and looking at the other TADs that are very active and knowing the realities for us, where we're not seeing the benefit that the city or maybe other entities are seeing. We're seeing where we're losing enrollment with people being priced out.
That's correct.
That's the truth. So I guess what I'm getting at is the conversations, any plans to have additional conversations just to talk about where we are at this point?
I think there'll absolutely be conversation around all of the above. We're taking in all the TADs. Had some opportunity to spend some time with Lisa yesterday or the day before and kind of talk through all of this. I think as mentioned earlier, the point is right. Number one, we want the board to be fully aware of what's out there. I think as mentioned, we have not heard any conversation explicitly to myself or to her around this, but you always, I won't say always, you hear, things outside. So this conversation is about awareness, I think, but I think it's also really clear that we need to be in situations that are mutually beneficial and that support student achievement. And so, to that extent, there are things in here that give me great question. I'll leave it there.
And I would just add the 2019 negotiation did get tied up in some legal action, so it wasn't fully implemented until 2022. And so while 2019 feels like a long time ago, we've been talking TADS for years behind the scenes and continuing to get this IGA fully implemented and negotiated. So when you asked about timely payments, we've only had 2 years really of the full implementation of the IGA. And so, yes, it has been going well, but it's been, if I feel like we've just gotten out of the TAD talk a little bit or had it simmer down a little bit. So Nina's nodding her head too. We've been in the weeds with TADS for a while now. So it doesn't feel as much of a refresher for us, but I know the board hasn't been involved in conversations around the TADS in quite.
And do have some familiarity with some of that. But yeah, we weren't obviously, I wasn't on the board. Even though obviously the commercial properties within the TADS are receiving a benefit, the 41% of commercial properties that are actively appealing their assessment, I would like to understand the percentage, however we can do it without having to do an inordinate amount of work, are within a TAD.
Yeah, we've preliminarily looked at that, especially around the Fulton County taxing authorities abatements and where they were approving abatements, sometimes inside TADS. And so we had a lot of concern around how that destabilizes even the financial structures of the TADS. So concerned about how these things would be in a position to close out if the commercial values that they are dependent upon in order to pay back the bonds are being underassessed, or if they're receiving abatements on top of any benefits that they would have as being a part of the TAD. So those types of like multiple funding or multiple benefits that a corporation might be benefiting from could also be destabilizing the TADs themselves. So we haven't done that work, don't have the team to do that work, but it is something we're aware of and at least have on the back of our in the back of our minds as a risk.
And I think that could be a focus with the city because it affects them too.
So I was just curious on slide 24, like this East Side tab, for example, lists some incentives that include educator housing opportunities. To what extent do we know, or if those opportunities were actualized, or how are we tracking? Is there a process in place to track and monitor those other kind of commitments that were made within the TAD?
Yeah, so those were TBD. We've been discussing with the team. We'll try to go back and historically pull what we've received as part of these negotiated benefits or incentives when we initially joined into the TADS. So we're pulling that information, but I don't have an answer for you right now.
Madam Chair, we do have a question on Zoom by board member Cynthia Briscoe Brown.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
Cynthia, thank you for
Okay.
joining us.
Thank you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but just wanted to say that in 2014, I was appointed to the board of Atlanta Beltline, Inc. by the then chair of the Atlanta Board of Education with the specific charge of resolving the Beltline TAD and getting our pilot payments. And while that took several years, we did finally make an agreement with that. One of our strongest supporters for making a deal for those payments was then City Council member Andre Dickens. And so it might be, this might be a good time to go back and talk about some of those TADs, knowing that he's been at least supportive of making an equitable resolution in the past. That said, I also want to follow up on some things that I think both Ken and Areta pointed up a few minutes ago, and point out that the most recent of these TADs was approved by anywhere from 2 to 4 boards previous to anyone who is currently on this board. And the first one predates any of us by 15 years. That's important as we discuss the both opting out of HB 581 and also a potential millage rate decrease, because those boards tied our hands for what we're able to do financially by entering into these very long-term agreements with very little way out. That's why I think it's important for us to both opt out of HB 581 and not commit to a decrease in the millage rate, which could potentially prohibit further increases, because I don't want to put future boards in the position that we've been put into by these TADs. I think we need to continue to maintain as much flexibility in our budget as possible and really take that into consideration. Also, I'd just like to second all of the concerns that have been raised about the commercial tax digest, which I think is really the way to resolve a lot of the issues that we're seeing happening. Lisa, is there a way that we could make it a priority to go to the city and maybe open a conversation with both Mayor Dickens and others about whether there's some way that we can unwind ourselves from some of the more onerous restrictions of these TADs? Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Yeah, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I think additionally, there's Erica Long was on, I know, and as we talk about that 41%, raising that at the state level as well. So trying to really work both avenues to get as much benefit for our students as we possibly can is necessary. So absolutely.
All righty. And then our last section for today is an update on the school allotments. So the principals did receive their budgets on January 15th. We spent the day with them at South Atlanta doing a training, doing a lot of support, answering a lot of questions. And I know that some principals walked out with their budgets built. So they're really good process, a really good day for meeting with all of the principals. They do have until February 28th to work on their budgets. So they'll be working with Go teams, with their local leadership teams to present their proposals and tweak those allocations over the next month. There are some changes that we wanted to highlight for the FY26 budgets, what schools are experiencing. Overall, the projected enrollment is up by about 500 students, but enrollment range is between negative 20% and 20%. So we're still seeing some schools that are losing enrollment significantly, while others are still gaining enrollment significantly. The average salary and the benefits are the primary story of the FY26 budget. So we're seeing the school budgets capture the full increase that we ended up with teacher salary increases last year. So the average salary that schools are using to purchase back positions is much higher than they saw this time last year, and the benefit rates are up as well. So the cost of a teacher is really putting a strain on the school's budgets. We did increase the base allocation so that we could offset that strain, but if it is a school that had a high percentage of their allocations, a higher than average percentage of their allocations and staff, they may feel additional pressure around building and balancing their budget this year. There is still shift school by school in demographics. And then also we are reviewing the program and position allotments outside of the SSF funding allocation. So we've teed this up with you a couple of times before, but we did reassess and establish a baseline allocation for every school. That required us to shift some of our SSF allocations back towards the base per pupil, and especially at the elementary grade levels, so that we're pushing more dollars into elementary schools. The only one cut that schools did experience this year is we cut that 1.0 ESSER step down flex position. So every school did feel that as a reduction. The rest was just a reallocation of the existing resources. One thing our high school and middle schools are seeing this year that's new, our AVA and Phoenix programs are funded outside of the school allotments. We don't receive any state funding for those programs, and the FTE, the student count for those programs, sits in the traditional school. So while we are fully funding the AVA and Phoenix programs, we are also funding those students at their home school at 100%. So we are budgeting for a student in, say, South Atlanta that may never step foot in South Atlanta because they are a 100% virtual student. And so one of the things that our middle schools and high schools are seeing on their budgets this year is a holdback for the forecasted number of students that are or will be attending Phoenix and AVA, so that we're not double funding for those programs. We would be truing that up during our leveling process on the 15th day count. The other big thing that the schools are seeing this year that's different, we're giving them a chance to play zero-based budgeting, just like our departments are doing this year. So they're doing that specifically around two of their programs, signature programs, and for some schools, turnaround. And so what we've asked them to do between now and February 1st is to complete a template within their budget that says how they have used their signature program dollars and or turnaround dollars in the past, specifically to support those programs, and what they would need in order to continue those investments going forward. We will pull those allocations out and review school by school to determine what a formula would be to then allocate to those programs. So those funding streams are coming for the schools. They opened their budgets with a big zero and a lot of deficits, and we spent a lot of time talking through what that process would look like for them. But we have earmarked the funding for signature and turnaround. We just need to identify what that allocation would look like school by school. So this is a iterative process that we've not undertaken in the past with our principals, and it's been exciting to see them getting to weigh in more on what their allocations could be. We've talked about this slide before, but we did spend a lot of time this year revisiting what allocations the schools have flexibility around, what is tight and what is loose. They primarily have a lot of discretion around their master schedule and their core classes and their supplies and non-personnel allocations. Those things that require a lot of compliance or mandatory allocations are allocated from the central office, we're holding tight. Basically, everything else is flexible. Flexible doesn't mean that it's the wild, wild west. It just means that the principals have some discretion in those allocations, still must meet a minimum standard of service, and they have to provide some justification for how their flexibility aligns to their data and the outcomes and goals that their GO teams have set with them. But we basically said ask, right? So if you have some questions or some creativity or innovation around some of these programs, we're open to have conversations for how that would benefit students going into the next year. Overall, the split between SSF and the non-SSF allocations is about 60-40. So the bulk of the funding is still going out to schools in the flexible allotment, about 60%. 40% or $246 million is coming on top of the SSF allocation. Overall, we've increased the school allotments by $90 million. That's a huge number, but remember, $60 million was salary and benefits last year. So this is again, not end of budget cycle to now, it's last January to now. And so we did not have those raises built into the preliminary budgets for the schools. You can see here how that shakes out between the different weights. So a lot more, as I mentioned, going out through the base weight and the grade level weights. Still, we haven't come off of the poverty allocation overall or some of our other equity weights, but much more of the increase is being driven out through the base weight and the grade level weights. You're going to see a decrease in the small school supplement, but that's offset by the baseline allocation. And again, we've redetermined how we allocate for the baseline based on a portfolio of positions and non-personnel costs that every school should have. So we built the budgets two different ways, and we're funding up any schools that didn't receive enough through their SSF to meet that baseline allocation. I'll pause and take any questions you have about the school budget process so far.
So I have a question for Dr. Johnson. And really is your reaction, like how do you feel about these changes? And do you feel that with these changes that our schools are going to have what they need?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty excited about the changes. Overall, we had very frank conversations with schools. When was it? Last week, I guess it was. And, there was this robust standard of services document that had been created here at the district that as a former high school principal I looked at, and I was like, what is this? Because we were extremely prescriptive in regards to, so I believe in leadership. Let me just speak philosophically. And when you absolve leaders of having to lead, you end up owning the outcomes. And so we want our leaders to lead and to make really strong decisions with some defined autonomy. So I feel really good about that. I think there's a broader conversation. So I know we got the TADs and all the other stuff going on. We've got to talk operational about what we believe, what we're going to do. We've got to right size the district, and that's a tough conversation that I think as we continue to move forward, we've got to lean more aggressively and progressively into. When you look at the small school offset here, like that's a real conversation that this district's been doing. So I'm taking in all this information, and I'm looking at the operation of the district, and I'm saying there's a ton of opportunity to be more operationally sound. TAD, all the external things that we have influence on, but then also there's this internal component that we have influence on. And we've got to lean into both at the same time. For instance, in our small schools, when we send out the funding, one of the real challenges is I'll use a media specialist or a counselor, or you can pick any of those positions. We may be funding that school at a halftime level because they only have 165 students or 220, so whatever the number is. That may be what they're allocated. Well, we have to ask ourselves the question: is that the most appropriate and effective strategy for that subset of students? Right? I think not, but I think that's got to be a broader conversation. And it will be a broader conversation. So overall, I think we're in a strong spot. I think we're going to see leaders respond. I think we have opened up the opportunity for them to own the performance of their school. And that's really important. When you talk about being a charter school system, which I've leaned into, the opportunity to have local control is really important. We have an opportunity to provide really strong checks and balances and structures from the standpoint of accountability. And I get the indication all our leaders really want to be accountable to that. But again, we absolve them of that when we say, do this, and this. Well, it's baked. And so when the outcomes aren't good, they look back at the district and they say, well, you told me to do. I did what you told me to do. And so everybody's kind of doing this number. So we've got to take some of that away. We've got to say, okay, first off, who's taking all this time to create all these standards? That's question one. This really doesn't make sense. We got too much. So I won't go on and on too deep because I know it's all public. But there is a lot of opportunity to tighten up operationally in Atlanta Public Schools, and as a byproduct, what we're really trying to make sure that we do. So it's a delicate process because you want to continue to see student achievement improve while you're doing this really complicated business of really changing the entire structure a little bit, and we're in the midst of that. Like, this is the initial iteration of saying leaders lead, and I had one principal come up to me and he almost like really emotional about it. He said, "This is the first time in a while I've felt like I have the ability." Really good principal, good performance school, not on any list. I've had the opportunity to lead it, and he said, now I've got to figure out how to operate in that space. And so I think we're going to have a lot of opportunity to work closely with schools and to see what comes as a byproduct of this. I want to be clear about something. If you remember anything else, my directive to schools is to improve student achievement, period. It's not have 3 of these, 7 of those, 4 of those, 6 of these. There's a lot of ways to improve student achievement. Now, we're going to give strong suggestions around things like, you might ought to think about. But our one goal is to improve student achievement. And so we're decluttering some of the noise around improving student achievement.
So I just had a few quick questions on this slide here, 33, around some of the student weights, just for clarification. What is incoming performance? I see we zeroed out kind of that. What is that?
Yeah, so incoming performance was a historical weight that we've had since the implementation of SSF in 2018. What it did was looked at the number of students that were performing at a beginner's level in 5th grade, rising to the 6th grade, and applied that percentage to all student allocation. To all students in the building. So it was a way for us to, when we were first building it, to try to identify and allocate a weight that was based on student performance in a way that bulletproofed it from principal discretion in driving student performance for additional funding, right? So you don't want to create an incentive for funding around any sort of bad practices. So we were very, very careful about that. And also, so it was nuanced and it was complicated, and also couldn't actually align it to any improvement for students since 2019 when we implemented it. So that was one of the allocations we pulled from in order to help support the additional increases in base weight and grade level weight. You'll also see the zeroed out of concentration of poverty. That was another one where we had really driven additional dollars. It was a very small dollar amount, but it was concentrated in schools that had high percentages of poverty. We saw that was duplicative in some of the title allotments, and could have been contributing to some of the challenges we've had around spending down title allocations. And so the poverty weight itself is so high, 47 million this year going in poverty weight, that additional concentration of poverty concentrated in schools that were already receiving high amounts of title allocations may have put a challenge in that school in actually spending down their full allocation.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Bracken, and I love that phrase decluttering, Dr. Johnson. I'm gonna hang on to that. Probably will call it my own. So just signaling that, now, just so there's no confusion. So let me get to some decluttering. So we took back the ESSER flex position, and we put in a SRO in every school. That's a significant change from last year, right? Do I have that? I know these things maybe aren't tied together, but it seems like a little bit of a backslide in decluttering.
They're both there this year. So in the current year, FY 2025, we've both done the SRO in our schools, and also they have that.
Right. So I'm thinking about FY26. This coming budget,
FY26,
we've removed that position, and we've said we went to you may to now you shall. Am I reading that right?
We're talking about two different things. I think we have a broader conversation about school safety, but it's only elementary schools that have the additional.
Right.
Middle and high always had the position.
And so I guess I'm not here I don't have a point of view about that. I do love the idea of schools weighing in on that decision. And so it's sticking with the elementary schools. So elementary schools, that's good clarification. So those 50 elementary schools no longer get to choose that. They could have bought maybe an SRO with that ESSER position, maybe not. But now they have to have they will get an SRO, and they've lost that position. I know I'm connecting two maybe dissimilar things.
Those two things aren't connected, though.
They're not connected.
They're not. We're funding an SRO. We're funding an SRO as a baseline for safety and security, right? So it's different. The ESSER position is a choice, is 100%. I'm assuming that ESSER position 1.0, whatever it was a
so the
complete
ESSER
choice.
position was the equivalent of a counselor's salary, and that's because with the ESSER allocations, we saw most schools purchasing up those types of support service allocations with their ESSER funds, whether it be a counselor or a social worker. So the idea in those funds was helping for a step down as ESSER funds were coming off the table. However, we saw this year a reduction in those types of support services. They were going to classrooms or something else altogether. So I would say I wouldn't conflate the two.
I understand, but I can't help myself. And so it's just in the spirit of giving schools, I really want that conversation to be at the schools if possible. And I want to make sure that this investment is creating the outcomes that we're looking for. Because we are concerned about school safety. I know you've got your safety task force, but I'm concerned about additional, having additional suspensions, additional discipline. And so I haven't seen the data. I don't know if the data exists. But whenever we lean in and say you shall, we're going to do this thing for you, I want to make sure that it fits with that school community. And so I understand it's in the budget, but can we continue to take a look at it?
Yeah, I will say philosophically that I believe we should provide a standard of SROs at every school. And now is there a question around whether we offer, and I think it's something to pull apart. And this goes back to facilities. So we've got some really large buildings that don't have, I'll use a house as an example. The larger your house, the more you fill it up. The smaller your house, the more. So we have some of the large buildings where the student population isn't quite to the size to fill the building. And as a byproduct, they end up with 2 or 3 or 4 because of the amount of coverage that you have SROs. And I've found that some at the middle and the high school grade band. I want to be really clear though, so we don't get confused here. Those two areas are not connected. The ESSER fund and the SRO are completely disconnected. We didn't add an SRO in anticipation. I wasn't even here when the ESSER dollars were deployed, but in the anticipation we're going to cut ESSER dollars. ESSER dollars are federal mandate; they were going to be cut anyway. We had an SRO as a byproduct of setting a baseline standard for security, right? And so they're just two completely different things. Now, do we need to invest in mental health and do we need to invest in SEL and all the things? We absolutely do. Is there opportunity? And I'll tell you something we're leaning into. We have a good bit of fragmentation in regards to our I think our approach around SEL and students. I'm really working to get under the hood of how schools see and leverage the resources that are at the district, so to speak, because there is some fragmentation in regards to what we see. But to take those two positions and put them to take the ESSER and the SRO and to put it together, they're two completely different.
Fair enough, but we found the money instead of finding money to create an extra position at a school. We found money to buy an SRO at the district level.
Yeah. So to be clear, I think I think all of our schools are funded very, very well in comparison to what I've seen.
Understood. I guess my ask would just be to keep track of is it solving a problem that we hoped it would solve? And that seems like a reasonable question, because if we're worried about, we did this as a response to, we're concerned about bad people coming onto our campus. I understand that, but I want to make sure that the discipline and that, if we can just keep track of that.
We absolutely will. I want to be clear though. I want to be clear to set the right expectation for the board. I'm always really open. I don't necessarily believe that everything we invest in, there are two things you make decisions about. There are some things you invest in because it helps to make the experience better, right? There are some things you invest in that you tie directly to an outcome.
Hard to measure.
I don't see an SRO explicitly as a strat. I've never had. I was a principal with an SRO as as necessarily a strategy to reduce discipline infractions. That's not, I don't know that we're going to see that level of correlation.
I meant it
more,
goes the other way, that we see more discipline, that we see disproportionality in those schools. And I don't mean to drag us into this rabbit hole, so I'll stop there. But I just it's something that I've heard parents ask about, and so I'd like to, if we can. I mean, I guess we'll hear about it in the discipline area, and we'll hear a discipline update. A couple other quick questions, and then I'll step back. The holdback for AVA and for Hank Aaron, is that, when you say holdback, is that synonym for reduction? Phoenix, sorry, not Hank Aaron.
Yes, so they will see on their budget template.
It's a deduction.
Yeah.
Okay.
They'll see their full earnings, and they'll see a line on there that says AVA holdback, and it's
Okay.
the number of students that are forecasted to go from their school to participate in the full-time AVA program. And it's applied to their per pupil. Same for
The
Phoenix.
reason holdback suggested it might come back, it's not coming back. It's a
We will
deduction.
level, so the number of students that actually go, right? So this is all an estimate. This is
Got it.
how many students attended this year. So during the leveling process, we will look at how many students actually attend those programs from that school, and we will release those funds back to the school.
If
or
less of
release
those
it
schools
to
come back, but for every kid that goes to one of those programs, that money isn't.
It's gone
that,
because it's
there's
going
no more
to go
double
to
count.
those programs
Right.
to fund those schools.
And then just quickly on the zero-based budgeting for the signature programs, is that a cost-saving move for the district, or okay?
Ideally, it's cost savings, ideally from my perspective. And ideally, it is also a reallocation of funding to the initiatives that are most effective for those programs. And so I'm hoping to see some cost savings. I need additional cost savings to come from that. But we are going into it with an open mind. And so we've also heard from schools, especially through the lens of signature programming, where by high school, middle school, elementary, potentially those costs have not been taken into account in the same way. So it could be a redistribution where some schools do see more
Got it.
than they've had in the past
If they make a
years to
compelling
support needed.
case to
Yes,
administration.
and also we would still, I was very clear with this with the principals, we will still determine a formula to allocate. So it won't be that we're just funding what each school is requesting, but we will take that data in order to inform a formula that is more data-based and data-driven than it historically has been. And so there should be a redistribution of allocation that is more tightly aligned to student need to support those programs.
If I could just add to what she said about, she's approaching from the CFO lens. I'm coming out from academic. We want to see effectiveness, and to your earlier conversation around SROs, outcomes connected to the $17.3 or $4 million that we spend a year on signature, et cetera. And we've encouraged principals, this actually came up in our follow-up session, we've encouraged, there's some schools that, like, this is my signature, I love what I've got, I'm gonna keep moving forward with what I'm doing. There are some that have some ideas around some broader, different things, and we wanna provide room in partnership with their go-teams, obviously, for them to think in that way. So we're looking at it for effectiveness. I know there's efficiency opportunity potentially as well, but it's definitely effectiveness.
And I know Cynthia has a question, but real quickly to pick up on that, that was going to be my question around the turnaround and the zero-based funding, just how we are going to be measuring for effectiveness and how that will help inform us as a board going forward and how we focus in on our highest levers of impact. So however we get that information, I know this is just starting, but as we go forward, because back to Ken's point around choices, yes, we made a decision around SROs, I support that, but also like what other choices will schools be able to make when we really know the impact of the programming and what we have in place and what we might need. Also, I'll bring up, you said of the 90 million, 60 was for staff. So that's a choice we've made. And to your point, Dr. Johnson, about right sizing, like all this informs how we move forward and decluttering and really assessing what we have, and then appreciate the approach to signature programs and turnarounds funds and really understanding what is having the most impact and giving principals that opportunity to really lay it out and show what's having impact and then supporting them. But that will help us as we need to adjust. And anything you want to add to that, please
No,
do.
I think it's 100% right, and I think on the turnaround component, Gwen, we've spoke to Signature quite a bit, but I think it's the same approach with, with turnaround. So there's change happening there as well. We've got to really turn around if we're going to have turnaround dollars invested. We've got to really
I think the turnaround allocation and the small school weight are two that, with the very best intentions, have created some pressures around schools, because schools that are highly dependent on that small school weight lose small school supplement when their enrollment grows. And that's a challenge for those schools. In the same way, I've got a school that's been off of the turnaround list for 2 years that it's asking for turnaround allocations. And the goal is to be off the list, right? We don't want to incentivize. We want every school off that list so we can use that $10 million in a completely different way to help all of our students across all of our schools. And so, again, we need to continue to think very critically about these historical allocations that were put in place with the very best intentions, but how they might have incentivized or disincentivized behaviors over the legacy of those programs.
but let's be clear. We're going to be really, really clear. An 11% pay increase, although extremely tremendous for our educators, is a recurring commitment that has been made. And so, I even going through the interview process, I was really excited to hear about the 11%, right? And now I'm seeing the numbers, like really deeply. And it is a commitment that we've made, not the right commitment to our employees, but it is a very expensive commitment. And it does, in addition to, what we do with small schools, in addition to what we do with, turnaround and signature program, at the end of the day, there's only so many resources. And these are all decisions that have been made. I appreciate Cynthia being on earlier, talking about decisions over decades. Like, these are decisions that have been made over a period of time that frankly don't allow you to just do best practice in the way that you should. And look, I want to be abundantly clear. We're finding that some of the decisions that have been made have even been made in regards to right, wrong, and different. I've been there. A lot of people pick apart the decisions I've made in the past. So I'm not saying right or wrong, just stating fact from the standpoint of teaching and learning and things that we've invested in, and then we spend a lot of money around, and then we don't fully follow through on, and and then we've got a scattered approach. Because we are a charter school district, we can have a quasi-scattered approach in resources that are acquired at the school level, and we don't get the benefit of, really pushing at the price at a scaled purchase, because we've got a fragmented approach to some of those kinds of things. So they're just some foundational operational things that we need to really lean into and get tighter on, while still providing much more autonomy. I would say that principals, our standards of service document went from probably 20 pages to a 1-page document. So when we talk about principals having more choice and voice, they probably, I don't know that they have more choice and voice in this budget cycle than they ever will have. Now, that's our ROCAN. But they have more choice and voice in this budget cycle than they ever will have. So I think we've got to get really disciplined, really locked in, tighten our operation, and all these are things that we will continue to do through the course of the next several months and into next year.
Thank you so much for that. And of course, the whole focus is to improve student outcomes and what's having the most impact. And what we went through today, I hope we're able to also share out to the community so they don't feel like we're just potentially losing money at our school, especially schools that have had some of the funding that we're talking about. And yes, they've come off a list and they've felt the impact of that. But we in the past haven't talked about how we help support them going forward, really focused on impact for their students and how we, yes, giving them autonomy, but really evaluating and monitoring what's working, and how we can lean in more, and how we can have even more focus as a board to supporting what's working. And I just want to say, so people are clear, when I said both, when you're talking about SROs, Ken, and that conversation, I mean also having those mental health supports. It should never be one or the other, but we have to look at our structure to make sure we have those people who can be in place too. So Cynthia, I'm sorry, thank you for being patient, but this has been a really good conversation. Your
That's
question.
okay. It's been a great conversation. And actually, I want to ask one short question, and then I have a follow-up to comments that you and Superintendent Johnson have just made. The short question is for Lisa Bracken. On that slide 33, it looks like there are asterisks next to, I think it's English language learners and special ed. Can you, and there doesn't seem to be any description of what the asterisks mean.
Yep.
Can you just tell me what those mean?
For sure, that note must have fallen off at some point. But those allocations we always like to call attention to, because if you look at the gifted allocation, it's about $20 million going into our gifted program. But the expectation is that all of the positions, all of the non-personnel for the gifted program is purchased back out of that allocation. The English learners in special education, you see a much smaller dollar amount by those two, but those are supplementary to the positions. So all the positions for English learners and special education teachers and paraprofessionals are funded outside of SSF. In this bucket of $246 million on top of SSF. And so we always want to call attention to that, because there can be a misperception that we aren't funding those programs.
Okay, so some of the things that might be bought with that supplemental funding would be?
So for instance, I always use this as a potential opportunity. If I have a school with a high number of students who are English learners, I potentially also have a parent population that might be bilingual or not English speaking. And so I might use these supplementary dollars to also purchase a bilingual liaison or an additional front office secretary that is bilingual in order to support the that community or the needs of that allocation that would be supplementary to just the teachers in the classroom.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. And the other question is related to Dr. Johnson's comments about giving principals choice and voice. I truly believe that we have the best principal cohort we have ever had. They're doing a great job. They're highly qualified, and I think they are wonderful. However, our principals have a very wide range of experience as principals, experience in Atlanta Public Schools, and experience with budgeting, which I think is not something they teach in education programs in universities. And sometimes acting as what amounts to the CFO of your school is very foreign to people who have been in the education world their entire careers. How are we supporting, guiding, encouraging our principals at the level they need, understanding that some of them need very little of that, some of them need a great deal of it? How are we going to support and guide and encourage our principals in making good choices and in using their voices effectively?
Yeah, so I actually have a dissertation that touches on that. The primary way that we're approaching that this year, and it's been absolutely a wonderful experience, is I've been meeting with the cluster superintendents almost weekly at their regularly scheduled meetings, leaning in with Tommy Usher, Chief of Schools. And so a lot of it is at that support and oversight level, and so making sure that we are talking to the cluster superintendents about what they could and should be looking for in alignment with resources to student outcomes, in alignment with the data that they are seeing at the schools, having the conversations with principals and holding them accountable to those resource allocations. So I know you were going to
No,
say
I
something
think,
else
I
as
think
well.
you nailed it. So it's good to hear from you versus me. But defined autonomy, Cynthia, I would say is probably left the word defined out. So when we think about autonomy, there's a defined element that's there, and there are structures. So you obviously have the local go team, but you also have cluster superintendent and support here at the district. So the data will drive it. I think to your point, holistically, there is going through this first budget experience with principals and seeing the breadth of things that they have to take into consideration. The ones that have done it for a while, I absolutely are comfortable. The ones that are new, I could see how they could feel somewhat overwhelmed, frankly, by it. So that's where the cluster superintendent comes into play. That's where Lisa and her team come into play. HR, we all the departments are on the ground, taking them through it, supporting them with it, and we'll absolutely be side by side with them, shoulder to shoulder, and also pointing them towards what their needs are. You got three. You want three of these, but you really we need to look at that particular area where the outcomes aren't good. So, just a closer support structure around what principals are thinking and doing will absolutely be there.
I'd add to that, talking with them and coaching them about how to interact in a positive and effective way with their go teams, with their parent groups. There's also a wide range of engagement in the different schools and communities, and sometimes those can be intimidating for a principal, can be overwhelming, and just I think some coaching in how to really work as part of a team with parents and the community and the go team would be really helpful. I'm
Yeah,
done.
received, absolutely noted.
Okay.
So I'm going to pick on that up on that a little bit, and I have two questions. So the first is kind of I share the desire, of course, to support our principals, and I also see value in that support, and I believe we're already doing it, and I just want to make sure in the GO team. So the principal doesn't do this alone. They've got a team that supports them, that asks the right questions. So just making sure that they too are receiving that support, and just elevate that is a concern, a desire, just especially when you're thinking about equity. All GO teams are not made up of CFOs, lawyers. Some do. Some have, architects and all that stuff on them as well. But some, and not to downplay the role of being a mother, right? Because I am. But some simply are coming to the table with the skill set that they have. And the experiences that they have, and their voices are valuable, but just a desire to make sure that they are in complete understanding of the power that their voice has, and asking the questions and asking the right questions, and that they feel like that they have the proper skill set really to do that. So again, just making sure our principals are supported, as well as those who are supporting them are supported. And I'll pause to see if there's anything you want to say there. So the next question is around the SSF allocation overview, and just making sure, so when doing this, it's basically allocated to the makeup of what the school was the year before. So we are assuming that this will be your makeup. So my question, and specifically around English language learners, as I've been in the community, I'm seeing a very strong influx of Spanish-speaking families in the Washington and Douglas clusters. They may not show up on the roll today, but they're going to be there tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So is there leveling, if you will, that happens in these spaces where we realize, wow, you've got 30% more English learners than we anticipated for? Is there space for those types of adjustments, and are we planning for it? Because I see it, and if we don't see it in our schools, it's coming.
Yeah. So I will say that the percentage of the weight is so small for EL in SSF that truing that up wouldn't necessarily, it would be $1,000 here and there per school. Where we would true it up is in the positions. So if we're serving additional students, we will allocate additional positions to serve those students. And so that would come outside of SSF, and that is something that is more responsive. So and part of the reason why we don't look retroactively for things like special education and EL, we true up all year as new students come into our buildings that have specific needs or require specific services. We add teachers as needed in order to support those students, and we'll continue to do that.
So while it is a small percentage, it could may seem small. It may be bigger on the local level. And when you go from 10 to 30, well, it's a small. That's a big jump. You tripled your population. So I just want to make sure that we are just sensitive to that and paying attention.
We can
Thank you.
look for that during our leveling process this year to see if there's any large swings in any of these demographic categories that would require us to take that second look.
Thank you.
And the only thing I would add is that I think to your earlier point, you don't know sometimes fully whether you're going to have 30 additional students EL or, like how the numbers are going to flux and flow. It's hard to sometimes fully anticipate. So I can assure you that it's something also that the cluster superintendent will be advocating for at the table on a weekly basis. Those folks are, I'll tell you structurally, I meet with them every single week to understand what's happening at schools and what challenges they're getting an understanding. So if we get in a situation where, we've got an influx somewhere, we're going to know pretty quickly and be able to lean in and support. And we'll always do that with any particular subgroup or area, because frankly, and we're not getting into academics here, when you look at where the opportunity is in Atlanta Public Schools, it's around the subgroups. And so 100% yes.
Okay, so to wrap up, our February meeting is currently scheduled for February 27th. At that meeting, we'll be doing a deep dive into the central office allocation, well, not allocations, but the central office historical budgets, and we'll look at some of the work we've done in the current year to start streamlining and redirecting some savings from the current central office allocations, and then also some of the targets and goals that we've set for central office as they're building their budgets. Their budgets won't be complete until February 28th. That next day is when we're closing them out, but we'll be having preliminary conversations using the month of February to start deep diving into these budgets, and we do have some targets that we're trying to get back out of the central office, so we'll tee that up. And then at this point in time, we are still planning to have our compensation conversation where the Chief Human Resource Officer, Nicole Lawson, will present her recommendation for compensation for FY 2026. So we're expecting that in February as well. Any final questions for me?
Not specifically a question, just recognizing, we're in this part of the budget development process, and there's a lot of information, and we're individually sharing it out with our communities, but continually looking at opportunities that are coming as we get farther in the process. This is such a good space to have conversation, ask questions, get more information out, but we know not everybody is able to tune in or be present. So I just want the public to be aware that we know this is a lot, and there's so much great work happening here, and we are collectively looking for even more ways to engage with folks, and
Sure.
more is coming. So reach out to us anytime with questions, and of course, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Bracken, myself, and segue into public comment.
Madam Chair,
Anyone?
we do have one public
Anyone?
comment. Kelsey Hood.
Great. Great, thank you. Thank you. It's not supposed to respond, but thank you. No pressure. Just send us an email later, at least. All right. Thank you, Chair Mitchell, for joining us as well. Appreciate you. Great. Thank you for being here. And Board Member Briscoe Brown for being online, and Dr. Zeff. Thank you so much. I tell you, it's the best next to audit committee and board development. Well, thank you to my colleagues, Dr. Johnson, everyone today for another great Budget Commission meeting. We will see you February 27th. In the meantime, reach out and we'll be out in the community. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Great.
Aye.
Thank you all. See you.
Oh.